Welcome to part 2 of the MeshForge tutorial series, and today we're going to be talking about the splitter tool. So I've already brought in a prefab. I'm going to be working with this asset from Cinti Studios. This is a part of their Polygon Apocalypse Wasteland pack. We'll start by opening up the MeshForge splitter window. Go ahead and dock it. There is a lot going on here, so I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. And in our more advanced tutorial on this tool, we'll cover a little bit more. Okay, so to get started, we'll look at the setup here. We have the reset button. This actually resets all the fields in the window itself. So it removes any assets, stuff like that. Does not reset the settings or anything. Those are things that are user defined and they get saved even after the window's closed. So those won't be reset. You'll have to manually set those however you wish. So again, we have the save folder. This is just where all of the assets are saved once you're done working with them. Mine is defaulted to modular character parts. This is actually the default of the whole system. You can change it to anything you want. The source skin mesh, this will be the skin mesh renderer of the object that you actually want to split. Using custom prefab, we won't do that this time, but it basically allows you to use a different asset as the target for your mesh. And I'll go in more depth in a different tutorial. Hidden material, that'll be actually found here in MeshForge under materials. So I only made 3 materials for the 3 render pipelines. And that's just a way for you to hide your submeshes. You could put any material in here you want, but the idea is it's meant for hiding things, right? So you would want to use something that's transparent. The use render pipeline default material for mesh preview, that mouthful. This is actually for when you create the preview in the scene that you're going to be working with. You can decide whether you want to keep the materials that are actually already on the character model, or you can just use the pipeline's default materials, and it'll set it typically to a lit or unlit white color. That is helpful sometimes, especially if your character has very bright colors or very dark colors and it's hard for you to see all the groups. Having just a flat white surface to paint triangles can be really helpful. And I personally, I'm going to work with it. I'm going to work with it off, but feel free to click that on if you'd like to just have that blank slate to work with. Okay, so for the flood fill settings, I'll have to explain this later in this tutorial, so that way we can connect it to something that makes more sense. So we'll start by validating. Oh, it's going to give us a error here because we actually don't even have anything located on the window. So what you want to do first is drag your skin mesh renderer here and then validate the setup. We got that validation message. We'll go ahead and load the mesh data. Okay, so we've loaded in the character. It will take the character directly to your scene view. So just be aware of that. You can move like I did the prefab, so you're not crowded when you're trying to work with the mesh. So a few additional settings popped up once the mesh was loaded into the scene. You have your submesh visibility. Typically with a asset that has more than one submesh, you would have a bunch of these fields, but in this case we only have one. So when I turn this off, it's going to make the entire mesh invisible. But if I had more than one submesh, it would only make that submesh invisible, which is very useful for things like working with the surface underneath the submesh. Okay, so now we have the unprocessed triangle edges settings. So this first button, as you can imagine, shows us all of the unprocessed edges. So I typically leave that off unless I need it for validation checks. The edge color is going to be the color of those unprocessed triangles. And then the handle draw distance is how far away from the camera the triangle has to be to actually render in the color. So once I add a new group, that's when you'll actually be able to see the unprocessed edges. So wherever I move the camera, as long as we're within 1 unit of that triangle, it's gonna color it in. Okay, the more of those triangles that get drawn in, the more you're gonna see a performance hit. So that's exactly why we have this distance here. I actually, when I work with the splitter, I'll keep it at 0.5, just because I only really need to see what I'm working with directly. I don't need to see all the way on the other side of the mesh. And in addition to that, I usually have it off unless I'm actually checking to make sure that everything is drawn to the correct group and that I didn't miss anything. Okay, so now to go into the groups themselves. Once I click to add group, you'll see a lot more stuff popped up. You got the group itself and you have reset all groups. So a few things, resetting all groups it'll keep the groups in here, but it'll set them all to their default values. You have 3 different modes: boundary mode, paint mode, and seed mode. And I will go through each one of these in depth here in a second. But to finish out what each of the new fields are, you have a naming field. So we'll start this with actual strong naming convention like hand underscore right. So my naming convention I took from Cinti Studios naming convention. They have a set of modular character parts for a modular character asset pack, and they have a specific naming convention, and so that's what I decided to use for mine. But really, the group name should be whatever you're actually working with. The idea here is every time you work to split a mesh, you are keeping the same name for the same thing you are actually splitting. So that way, everything gets organized into the correct subfolders in the hierarchy. And I'll show you more in depth when we get to that point. So I'm renaming mine hand right, which means I'm going to be working with the right hand here. And there's a couple more buttons you can see. We won't dive into those just yet. I want to show you the boundary mode first. All right, so let's get a bit closer. The boundary mode. So this is where we draw triangles that we're going to use as the boundary for processing the group. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's start with what the boundary should look like. The boundary should be an enclosed shape of some kind that encloses a section that you want to become its own group that can be filled in. The boundary itself is inclusive, so it'll be the color of the group you're working with. So in this case, hand right is pink. The boundary is pink. These boundary triangles will be a part of the hand right group. Now, another example of what an enclosed shape might look like, and this is where you can do some really interesting things, but I'll just show you briefly here. A closed shape could be this. So we have a closed shape now around this set of triangles right here that are completely empty. And if I click on show unprocessed, you'll see that it's an unprocessed area here. So you can do some interesting stuff with boundaries to create enclosed shapes. They don't necessarily have to wrap around something. They can be enclosed as such, and the fill algorithm will still work. All right. So it's very easy to use the boundary mode. Left click is to actually color in, and then the right click is to remove. You can either single click or you can hold it down and drag across. Now we're going to go to the seed mode. So this is what brings everything together here. Now that we have our boundary, we can actually draw a seed You don't need just one seed. You can have multiple, especially if your mesh starts to get very complex in terms of its geometry. I might place some seeds here in the crevices of the thumb to the index. I might place a couple here at the tip along here. So just be aware that the seeds are treated differently than what the boundaries are treated as. When the boundary is set, that says everything from the point of the boundary to the seeds is what's going to be filled in. Okay? And this is what brings us to our proximity threshold and seed direction threshold. So first things first, the proximity threshold. This will be the proximity to basically find the neighboring triangles to fill it in. I found that 0.05 is a good starting point, but it may need to be adjusted up or down depending on how complex your mesh is. Play around with it. The values are very sensitive, so I wouldn't go too crazy, and bring this all the way up to 1 or down to 0. Just stay within that 0.0 dot 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 range, right? So 0.05 was what it was initially at. I would keep it here for now. For the seed direction threshold, that's going to be what actual direction the boundary is going to move towards the seed. 0.5 is 180 degrees, so that's in this system, that is straight from the direction of the boundary to the seed. So 180, we can see if this was like a radius, right? 180 would be this line here, forward. Hopefully that's clear. But let's go ahead and actually process. So when I go down here, the seeds are placed, the boundary's placed, I press process, and it'll fill in to the seeds. Again, it goes from boundary to seeds. I know it's atypical of what you might see in a normal situation with seeds. Typically, things sprout out from the seeds, but in our case, they're moving towards the seeds. So a bit of a difference there. Okay. But as you can see, there are no missed triangles. If you want to be sure, like I said, you can click Show on Process Edges. And you'll see that nothing was missed here. Okay, go ahead and turn that off. Now what we want to do is we'll add another group. The second group, we'll call it arm_rights. So now we're going to be working with the right arm. So you'll notice one thing is like consistency is very important when you're actually deciding what is considered a group. What you'll see is when you're actually modularizing your characters, you want the cutoff points to be about the same. So that way, when I modularize this arm and hand on this asset, it's modularized the same on another asset. So you kind of want to define where your separation points are beforehand. One easy way to do that would bring in all the models first that you want to modularize and just kind of compare what positions you want to start your splitting at. So let's go ahead and start here by deciding a point and look for our natural boundary. I believe our natural boundary with the arm is here. So I'll start by holding down left click and painting a boundary around the arm. Okay. And then, so now that we have boundaries done, we'll switch over to seed mode. Don't forget to switch between these. It's very easy to forget. Now, again, seed mode, you're just going to put it wherever you want. The great thing about having groups as well is that there's going to be no overlap, so this group will not overtake the group you already have set. As soon as you set down that boundary, that's basically a line in the sand. Triangles from other groups won't cross. So one good strategy would be to set your boundaries first. You could do it that way, so that way you know there's not going to be any leaks into other areas that you don't want triangles to be. All right, but we have the seeds down, we have the boundaries down. Let's go ahead and process this group, see what happens. I'm going to turn this up a little bit more just so I can show you guys. Okay. So as you can see, doesn't look like we missed anything. And looks like the boundary was set correctly. All right. We'll move on to the left side. Okay. So again, having that predefined section where we're going to be splitting is important. For this, we're going to have it right here. Somewhat, we're going to try and match symmetrically the other hand's triangles. Okay, so when you add a new group, it automatically sets it to boundary mode. So you can just begin drawing with that second group quickly right then and there. Okay, there we go. And then seed mode. All right, we got our seeds, we got our boundary, we're going to process, and there you go. Ah, look at that. There's a little bit of a straggler here. So one good rule of thumb that I've learned after using this tool a lot is that just look around the edges to make sure that your edges aren't bleeding. This does happen. Again, it's because of your proximity threshold here. It's going to be looking for neighbors that are within that proximity. And sometimes it does cause the triangles to leak out of its designated areas. All you have to do is just erase it. And there we go. All right. So next group. We got our arm left. So choosing that designated point again. All right, so this one's kind of a special situation here, right? Because of the way the boundaries are set up. My boundary is actually going to be here, or not the boundary, sorry. The way the topology is, you can see that the boundaries aren't going to be, they're not going to look the same, but you're going to want to try and find the closest possible comparison for both sides. Okay, you can see that that's symmetrical there. Okay. There is no limits, by the way, of how many triangles you can add to make a boundary. So I can actually continue to, if I'm worried about like bleeding and stuff, especially in more complex topology, I can set my boundary to be to have more width here, so the boundary is better defined. Go to seed, just paint across there. Again, it's pretty good at finding where it needs to go, but more seeds the better. All right, processing. And we can see here, let's turn this on just to make sure we didn't miss any triangles. Doesn't look like we did. Looks even, looks symmetrical. All right. Turn this off. Let's add another group. We'll call this one head. Okay, yeah. So this is where things are going to be interesting. You can see here that we have this collar, it looks like. Gonna change this color. Okay, so you can see we have a bit more here regarding the collar. One thing you can do, which could be interesting, is you could actually, if you wanted to reuse this collar for other assets, again, for modularity, you could actually remove this and make it its own skin mesh. Same with this, this strap here. the belt, anything you want to separate. For demonstration purposes, I'm only going to show separating limbs for now, but you can separate any object on a character's mesh that you think could be interesting in single component. All right, we got seeds. We can plant them wherever we want, and we'll go ahead and process. Check for bleeding. Check for missed triangles. Okay, so for missed triangles, you're going to want to use paint mode. So paint mode allows you to just fill in gaps in the mesh that you might have missed. Another interesting thing about paint mode is that paint mode is the only mode where you can just start to apply triangles and it's going to apply directly to that group. The boundaries and the seeds are dependent on you processing the group itself. Paint mode allows you to freely paint, and those triangles will automatically be applied in the final mesh. So if I was to put a group of triangles here, in the final mesh, these triangles will be a part of the head. But if I was to use boundary mode, let's say, and paint triangles here, these triangles will not be a part of the head because they're defining a boundary. So they haven't been processed yet. Now, granted, we did process already, but these weren't processed with that initial processing. And so they won't be applied to that group. Okay, and last but not least, I'm going to add one more group. It's going to be called leg. We're going to change that color. We don't want it to match the unprocessed edge. Purple. Okay. So from here, we got the boundary. So I'll go ahead and just draw this in real quickly. Go ahead and just fill in the rest of this. There we go. Okay. And I'll go ahead and put in some seeds here on the feet. Some trouble areas are typically the bottom of the feet where the soles are. So just start throwing down seeds there. Here in between the legs can be an issue area. Again, we want to look for any areas that might have some complex topology and just add some seeds to it to make sure that it gets filled in correctly. Let's go ahead and process the group. And I'll raise this so that we can see exactly what we missed and hit. Missed one triangle there. Let's go to the soles. Got everything there. Okay, so not too bad. We're going to want to go to paint mode to finish this off. So you can leave this on so you can look at what you're working with in terms of the unprocessed triangles. Like I said before, I always leave it off because of the performance impact. And it's not too hard, at least on these meshes, to see where the missed triangles are once you actually check them once. The issue is if you can remember where everything is when you turn it off. All right. This is what I was talking about earlier. There's a bit more edge bleeding. And again, this is because the proximity threshold, when the algorithm's looking for neighbors, it seeks anything within that distance, which means that the border itself wasn't large enough to prevent the bleeding. So let's go ahead and hold down right click to remove some of these excess triangles. All right. One other thing of note is right here, you'll see that the mesh continuation from our boundary is perfect, and it's underneath this kind of belt object. But if we go over here and look underneath, you'll see that this part of the mesh is actually cut. So that's something you can fix on the gap filler. We don't need to worry about it right now. If you wanted to, you can make this belt its own object as well. Like I was saying before, you can get pretty creative with this kind of stuff. It's pretty fun. All right, now that all that's done, I'll talk briefly about some of these other settings here. To start with, process incomplete group. What that'll do is it'll actually fill in for that group any other unprocessed triangles. So it can be very useful, but it can be dangerous. Useful in the sense that we would be able to all those triangles that we missed, we'd be able to process them very quickly without having to do it manually. However, because there's no boundary here for the torso, if I was to hit process incomplete group, it'll actually fill in the rest of this mesh wherever it's unprocessed. So use that sparingly, or if you're in a situation where it's very hard to reach triangles, then you can use that to kind of capture those. You may have to press it a bunch of times. It works directly with paint mode, by the way. So the paint mode acts as the new seed for your secondary process. It'll seek out the triangles painted with paint mode and try to reach them. So just be aware that it kind of ignores, it can ignore boundaries. To avoid any additional work, I'll just leave this ungrouped. And then if you go down here, you'll see that you can allow ungrouped triangles to be made into their own groups. So what that means is anything that you didn't deliberately set into a group can be made into its own group. Meaning this torso will be made into what's called an ungrouped group. And you can rename it whatever you want. You can rename the group whatever you want. But it helps save on work, especially if you have whole sections that you don't really feel like filling in. You can leave it ungrouped, and that whole part of the mesh will become its own section. Okay. So then I went ahead and hit the separate parts and save. So if I go into my modular character parts folder, you'll see two new folders, skin split prefabs and skin split meshes. These are your meshes and your prefab. All right, this is all I have for this tutorial on the basics of the splitter tool. Next time for part 3, we'll go into more advanced splitter uses and other cases that might come up. And we're going to try and debug and fix some issues that you might run into. Okay, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.